Quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. I'd now like to recognize myself for an opening statement. Today in Venezuela, there are over 600 political prisoners. The country is a failed state and a humanitarian disaster. Since April, more than 125 people have died. Over 2,000 have been injured in protest at the hands of the Venezuelan government. Food, medical supplies, and basic goods remain scarce. The legitimate, democratically elected National Assembly has been silenced in favor of a sham constituent assembly full of President Maduro's supporters. The previous Attorney General has fled the country after publicly opposing Maduro's abuse of power. Today, Venezuela has entrenched itself as a dictatorship, unmoved by international condemnation and the pleas of its people. The political, economic, human rights crisis in the country is appalling for the 30 million citizens of Venezuela, and it threatens to destabilize the region. The United States has very clear interest in Venezuela. We want regional peace without masses of refugee flows or public health threats from rising crisis and cases of malaria, diphtheria, or Zika. We want to see a democratic country that represents the rule of law and that is accountable to its people. We want to see a country that doesn't use its power to beat up, imprison, torture, and kill its own citizens. We want to ensure that Venezuela does not become a narco state that provides safe harbor to terrorists or transnational criminals. We want a stable energy market that promotes energy security. We also want to certify that Venezuela does not become a pawn for Russia, China, or Iran to exploit for their own geopolitical purposes. And bottom line, we care about the Venezuelan people and we want to see them prosper. Let me repeat that. We care about the Venezuelan people and we want to see them prosper. To those ends, the U.S. Congress has issued public statements and passed legislation calling for the Maduro government to return to a democratic order. This subcommittee has held 4 hearings on Venezuela over the past 2 years. President Trump has affirmed that Venezuela remains a U.S. priority, and his many efforts combined with Vice President Pence's recent visit to the region underscore U.S. solidarity with our partners in the region and with the Venezuelan people and our commitment to see the Venezuelan government end its embrace of tyranny. I commend President Trump and his administration for their efforts, and I want to underscore that we support further U.S. and international action to pressure the Maduro regime and to convince those who follow his leadership that they will not succeed in destroying the country. While the United States, under President Trump's leadership, has been unwavering in our support for the Venezuelan people, many other countries in Latin America, Europe, and Asia have also demonstrated courage and conviction in jointly condemning the breakdown of democratic order in Venezuela and in offering full support and recognition for the democratically elected National Assembly. I believe it is critical that we continue to speak and act together in our support for the Venezuelan people. Dialogue alone is fruitless without a series of preconditions that level the playing field for democratic actors and without corresponding simultaneous multilateral pressure. Therefore, I strongly urge other countries to continue their efforts to step up said pressure. Recently, I, along with the ranking member Series, led a congressional delegation visit which included Ms. Kelly and Ms. Torres and Mr. Espaillat of this subcommittee to the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Colombia, and Peru. In our meetings, we emphasized U.S. congressional commitment to supporting democracy, rule of law, and human rights in Venezuela and urged greater regional cooperation to call out the Maduro government for its reprehensible behavior against its own people and to pressure the Venezuelan government to restore the country's democratic institutions. Decisions like Mercosur's suspension of Venezuelan and recent Lima Declaration, which was signed by 12 Latin American countries, are important steps in that direction. With that in mind, I strongly urge the European Union to enact sanctions on the Venezuelan dictatorship, to cut off another important source of financing and ratchet up pressure on the Maduro regime. Yet regardless of any strong measure the U.S. or other countries in the Western Hemisphere and the European Union may take against the Maduro government, various state and criminal actors have undermined those measures' effectiveness and blunted our objectives. Cuba, China, Russia, and Iran are underlying the supporters of the Maduro regime. Beginning with the rise to power of Hugo Chavez, the Cuban dictatorship has exported its system of oppression to Venezuela under the guise of medical doctors and teachers. For their part, Russia and China have funded the expansion of Venezuela's military arsenal and invested heavily in Venezuela's corrupt state-owned oil company, PDVSA. Iran has attempted to strengthen economic and diplomatic ties with Venezuela through visits in 2016 by Iranian President and Foreign Minister. Multiple reports exist of Hezbollah's activities in the country. Just earlier this week, President Maduro met with President Rouhani to strengthen their cooperation. In addition, criminal organizations also operate in the country with unfettered access, fueling corruption, graft, and an increase in narco-trafficking and other illicit activities. A few years ago, U.S. government drug trafficking maps showed virtually all suspected drug trafficking flights from South America originating in Venezuela. Today, we're seeing drugs from Venezuela entering neighboring countries as well as heading to the United States. Yesterday, the State Department affirmed that drug trafficking organizations have completely penetrated virtually every security, law enforcement, and justice-related institution in the country. And any solution to the Venezuelan crisis requires a solution to the drug trafficking organization presence. In February 2017, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Venezuelan vice president, designated him as a drug kingpin, and revealed the Venezuelan government's complicity in drug trafficking. Questions remain regarding Venezuelan government's ties to foreign terrorist groups and concerns about Russian and Chinese arms falling into the hands of these or other criminal actors. Today, we want to examine the role these actors play in sustaining the Venezuelan dictatorship and consider what might constitute an effective U.S. and international response. With that, I'll turn to the ranking member for his opening remarks, and I look forward to hearing from our panelists today. I'll turn to the ranking member for his statement.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for holding this timely hearing. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. We have watched, as week after week, Maduro continue to expand his authority at the expense of the Venezuelan people. Just last month, the National Constituent Assembly, the fraudulently elected puppet Congress orchestrated by Maduro, approved a presidential decree giving itself authority to pass legislation replacing the opposition-dominated and legitimate elected National Assembly. Political prisoners continue to be kept under lock and key, while families are unable to access basic necessities such as food or life-saving medicines. Despite all this, Venezuela continues to enjoy the support of some Latin American and Caribbean nations, in addition to others which help prop up the Maduro autocracy. When the Organization of the American States recently tried to press Maduro to take concrete steps to improve the human rights situation and restore democratic institutions, the resolution failed because a number of small countries abstained or voted against the measure. It is worth noting that 95% of the Western Hemisphere lives in countries that have voted to strongly condemn the Maduro regime's actions. There is a consensus among the majority of the Hemisphere, multilateral institutions such as the OAS and the United Nations and the European Union, that Maduro is destroying democracy and violating human rights. In order to reach a sustainable political situation, it is imperative that we work with our allies in the region and around the world to present a unified condemnation of Maduro's autocratic regime and fight together for a restoration of democracy for the Venezuelan people. I am encouraged that regional leaders in Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Canada, and many others are criticizing the Maduro for this gross abuse of human rights and hope that more join their neighbors in calling for a resolution to this crisis and productive engagement with the opposition. Maduro's descent into authoritarianism has not only jeopardized the lives of innocent Venezuelans, it has also created an environment ripe for dangerous foreign influence from countries such as Iran, Russia, China, and Cuba. The State Department has already noted that Venezuela is home to several individuals linked to designated foreign terrorist organizations, including Hezbollah, as a continued sponsor of terrorism. Iran's interest in Venezuela should be a concern to the Western Hemisphere, as Cuba continues to embed itself deep within the Venezuela security network. Chinese and Russian presence in the country's economic activities provide new opportunities for influence within the region. I believe that it will take a coordinated effort amongst the Western Hemisphere nations to present a viable solution to the ongoing crisis in Venezuela. And I am hopeful that more regional partners will come forward in denouncing the Maduro regime. I am eager to hear how our panelists view the role of external actors play in the decaying situation in Venezuela, and look forward to their recommendations as we continue to grapple with this complex issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Sears. The chair will now go to Mr. DeSantis for an opening statement.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you for having the hearing and your attention to this issue. It's very important. The more and more we've seen the Venezuela piece, the more and more we can say that the Obama administration deal with Cuba has been a total failure, because Cuba and the Cuban military are driving a lot of the bad things that are happening in Venezuela right now. And of course, we have these reports of diplomats being harmed in Havana. We still don't have all the facts on that, but I don't know how you can spin that as anything other than an attack. The evidence is just too overwhelming. So we obviously need to hold Maduro accountable, but we need to hold the Cuban government accountable too, because they are the root of a lot of these problems. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. No other members have opening statements. Before I recognize the panelists, you'll notice a lighting system in front of you. 5 minutes is what you'll be recognized for. When it starts to get down to a minute, yellow light will come on. And when you run out of time, it'll be red. If you could acknowledge that and start wrapping up your statement to help us stay on time. Members, all the bios for the witnesses are in your binders and provided earlier, so I'm not going to read those. And once the witnesses offer testimony, all three, we will go into the question and answer portion of it, and each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. So I'll start with Mr. Toro. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chairman Duncan. I wanted to focus today on the role of Cuba. I think when we talk about foreign influence in Venezuela, it's really Cuba and then the also-rans. The influence of Cuba has been so overwhelming. On Sunday, October 14th in 2007, then President Chavez made a startling statement during his famous Allo Presidente show, which was broadcast from Santa Clara in Cuba then. He was addressing Fidel Castro directly across from him when he said, deep down, yes, we are just one single government. Venezuela has two presidents, but we are one single government. We're advancing towards a confederation of republics. Now that's obviously a bit of overstatement. There are separate governments and separate juridical traditions, etc. But the ambition that Chavez and Fidel Castro had was for something beyond a normal alliance. And we've seen it play out over the last 10 years in really nefarious ways. I think it's important to understand that Venezuela always had 4 traditional service branches in the armed forces: the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the National Guard, which is like a military police. But on Cuban advice in 2005, a 5th service branch was added called the Milicia Bolivariana, the Bolivarian Militia, which is an avowedly political arm of the ruling party, organized, trained, and armed as a military force. Okay, the Bolivarian Militia has been derided over the years as sort of a granny's army. They don't seem to be much of a fighting force, but there are hundreds of thousands of Chavista political activists under arms. And we've seen this that in the last couple of years, the Bolivarian Militia has become more powerful. President Maduro has made a calculated decision to strengthen the Bolivarian Militia. And what is really concerning about this, and what I think that the committee should really sink its teeth into here, is that there have already been a series of leakages of weapons from the Venezuelan military to non-state actors, okay? So we see criminal bands in Venezuela that are dedicated to extortion, drug trafficking, but local drug trafficking, buying weapons, buying assault rifles, buying C4 plastic explosives from the military. And we see the Venezuelan military getting more and more powerful weapons under its control. Now, early last year, it was reported, Reuters reported that Venezuela had acquired over 5,000 surface-to-air, shoulder-mounted manpads missiles, so heat-seeking missiles that a single person could shoot. Those have been under the control of the army for the last several years since they were bought. We understand that as many as 1,000 of those manpad systems could be transferred to the Bolivarian Militia in the coming weeks. And while the army has leaky ways of keeping track of its stock of weapons, the militia has no system that we know of to log these weapons. So while weapons have been subtracted from the Venezuelan army for sale to criminal networks, the Venezuelan army, at least, and the Venezuelan security forces know that and have a way of tracking it. Once hundreds or perhaps as many as 1,000 manpads are transferred to the control of the militia, you can kiss them goodbye. There is no more tracking them. Earlier, a few weeks ago, when there was some tension with the United States following President Trump's declaration, it was very clear that the militia was given assault rifles to take home. There's a question, are we looking at a scenario here where the Venezuelan military could be handing political activists surface-to-air missiles, heat-seeking missiles that can bring down an airliner at 20,000 feet to take home? You have to understand that many of the Bolivarian militia members are rank-and-file Chavista activists. These are people who are often hungry, penniless and hungry. So we would be looking then really at a buyer's markets for these extraordinarily dangerous weapons. And that is a debate that I don't see happening anywhere, really, and I think that should change.
Thank you for that. I'm sure members will like to delve more into that. Now we'll go to Dr. Ellis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan. Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member Cyrus, distinguished committee members, thank you for the opportunity to share my analysis with you today. I will summarize what are my written remarks for the committee and would emphasize that these are strictly my own opinions and not those of my employer. I would like to emphasize how both Russia and China, in the pursuit of their commercial and strategic interests in Venezuela, have provided capital, goods, services, and political backing that has indirectly enabled the populist regime to ignore and ultimately destroy, as you alluded to, the mechanisms of democratic accountability. Between Russia and China, the PRC, in my judgment, holds the greatest leverage over the fate of Venezuela, with the control of financial instruments and loan-funded projects, as well as flows of goods important to the regime's survival. First, the PRC has become Venezuela's principal banker, with PDVSA moving current accounts from Portugal's Banco Espírito Santo to China's CITIC Bank in August 2014. Venezuela has also stored a portion of its gold reserves in China. Both actions potentially protect Venezuela's assets partially from international legal claims. However, they also give China influence over Venezuela in how it responds to such claims. Also, the PRC is Venezuela's major source of credit, as is widely known, having extended an estimated $62.2 billion to the regime since 2005 in the form of revolving credit relationships repaid by shipments of Venezuelan oil. As the majority of international companies have withdrawn from Venezuela, the work performed by Chinese entities funded by such credit has become increasingly critical for building and maintaining the oil, electricity, and transportation infrastructure to get Venezuela's oil to market. Indeed, just days ago, the China-Venezuela High-Level Mix Commission met and authorized an additional $2.7 billion in such new projects, including the construction of the Zhenjiang refinery in China to process Venezuelan heavy oil. China has farther provided Venezuela with billions of dollars of military goods on credit, displacing Russia as Venezuela's principal arms supplier. Systems sold, just to name a few, include JYL-1 radars, K-8 fighter trainers, Y-8 and Y-12 transport aircraft, SM-4 self-propelled mortars, SP-5 multiple rocket launchers, VN-1, VN-18, and CSVP-4 armored combat vehicles, CSLMG heavy machine guns, plus anti-submarine and anti-tank weapons, which are frankly a concern for neighboring Colombia if war should ever break out between the two. In addition, Chinese arms also include VN-4 armored cars and VN-16 light tanks, which have been very publicly used by the Venezuelan National Guard to suppress anti-regime demonstrations in recent weeks. Russia. Russia's activities in Venezuela have been more limited than those of the PRC, yet are still significant. Russia has sold over $11 billion of military hardware to Venezuela since 2006, including 10 Mi-35 attack helicopters, 38 Mi-17 transports, 3 Mi-26 heavy transports, 24 Su-30 fighter aircraft, 100,000 Kalashnikov rifles, 92 T-72 tanks, and approximately 200 BMP-3 and BTR-80 armored personnel carriers. Russia has also sold, as my colleague rightly alluded to, between 2,000 and 5,000 Igla-S anti-aircraft missiles, which also, I would agree with my colleague, could gravely threaten civil aviation were they to fall into the hands of terrorists. Russia has also used its relationship with Venezuela to project a military force into the region. Examples include the deployment of 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 backfire bombers in 2008, later a flotilla of warships the same year to Venezuela, and another deployment of Tu-160s to Venezuela in October 2013, and farther, the second sending of warships to Venezuela in March 2015 to conduct exercises. With respect to commercial support, the Russian state-owned company Rosneft has been a key financer for the Venezuelan oil sector, providing an estimated $17 billion since 2008. Indeed, as the liquidity crisis in Venezuela has deepened, Rosneft has provided an additional $6 billion in loans to PDVSA for future delivery of oil, in addition to the $1.5 billion that it loaned in December 2016 in exchange for the 49% interest in the PDVSA subsidiary Citgo. In formulating the U.S. whole-of-government strategy to restore democratic governance to Venezuela, and I also would commend the administration's efforts in that, I believe that the U.S. must structure its sanctions and other actions and strategic communication with an eye to convincing Russia and China that their continued support for Venezuela's anti-U.S. authoritarian regime will not get those countries to a stable, internationally accepted successor, which would legalize and make sustainable the deals that they have struck with those who have hijacked the Venezuelan state and its resources. While sanctions should be imposed, in my judgment, broadly and not only against U.S. purchases of Venezuelan petroleum, but also at the regime's access to the international financial system. In that I concur with your remarks about Europe, Mr. Chairman. While this course of action is harsh, I believe that it is the best among imperfect options short of military intervention to bring about change that most rapidly ends the suffering of the Venezuelan people, and with that same rapidity would deny Russia and China time to advance their position in the country through their own incremental deals which continue to prop up the regime. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair will now go to Dr. Trinkunis. Did I pronounce that correct?
Yes, you did, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member Saris, members of the subcommittee, it really is an honor to be here today to discuss the negative influence of external actors on the crisis in Venezuela. I am providing this testimony in my private capacity as an expert on Venezuela, its politics, and its foreign policy. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Saris, I concur with your assessment of both the situation in Venezuela and U.S. interests at stake here, so I will not dwell on those further. In my written testimony, which I'm summarizing here today, I focus on the role of China, Cuba, Russia, Iran, and illicit non-state actors in Venezuela. I'm happy to go into further detail on those in the Q&A, but I would like to make some broad remarks here before we go into specifics. The first thing I will say is that each of these actors in Venezuela plays a slightly different role, of course, as I detail in my testimony, but the important thing to note is they're all in Venezuela at the invitation of Hugo Chavez as part of his governing strategy back in the day before he was deceased. Chavez's plan was to use these actors to increase Venezuela's capabilities and to resist U.S. influence. The thing to keep in mind is when oil was at $120 a barrel, Chavez had the upper hand. Now that oil is at a third to half of that, it is Maduro's desperation that really makes Venezuela vulnerable. I'd like to make 4 main points at this time about the negative role of external actors in Venezuela. I concur with you that these actors are principally enablers. They basically provide capabilities to the Venezuelan regime that allow them to pursue catastrophic policies for longer and at less cost to the regime than would otherwise be possible. The second thing is that the catastrophic policies we now observe in place in Venezuela are primarily designed to benefit President Maduro and his allies. We should not assume that they're the result of either ignorance or external influence. They're very much designed to support the regime's coalition, transfer public resources into private pockets. And in fact, it is this involvement in corruption. Some officials are linked to drug trafficking. Some now are linked to human rights abuses, that these actors cannot afford a transition back to democracy. They fear being held accountable. That said, I do think that at this point in time, and here I'm focused principally on how these actors can keep the present regime in power, their primary motivation for working with the Maduro government is economic. They want to secure the biggest possible return on their investments or interacting with the Venezuelan regime. Of course, geopolitical interests, ideological interests may derive welcome benefits from that participation in Venezuela, but that is relatively secondary to their economic motivation. That said, I concur with Dr. Ellis that there may be some opportunities there in the sense that they may fear that the deals that they're making now may be invalidated in the future. Finally, I would say that not all of these external actors are having an equally negative role. I think that if you look at China's involvement over time, they've become more skeptical of the Venezuelan regime. They're more concerned about its ability to pay back the existing loans. They're somewhat disenchanted, as opposed to, let's say, the case of Russia, which I really do think is playing a very opportunistic role in these days, picking up Venezuela's oil assets for pennies on the dollar. That is there may be an opportunity there that the United States should be exploring. The final thing I would say is that I concur with you that with you and with the ranking member that we're seeing the most positive external environment for international collaboration to address the crisis in Venezuela since President Maduro took office. A decided shift against the Maduro regime, not just in Latin America, but also increasingly Europe, and that is something the United States, I agree with you, should capitalize on. That said, I'm skeptical that there are solutions in the short and medium term to the crisis in Venezuela, and that guides a set of recommendations that I'd like to make now. The first is, I do think it's time to begin serious contingency planning to address a full-scale humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. This means collaborating with efforts already underway in Colombia and Brazil to deal with Venezuelan economic and political refugees. It means shoring up the efforts of small island states in the Caribbean, which have already been badly affected by the recent hurricanes. It means increasing monetary assistance to credible civil society organizations that can actually get food and medicines to Venezuelans, maybe initially just on the border, but there may be other opportunities. And finally, I would say that we should talk to the states, including the ones that have negative influence, who have significant personnel present in Venezuela, the Chinese, the Cubans, to understand exactly what the limits of their support are. Are they willing to support at all costs, no matter what, or is there some room short of that could be explored? Second, deepen, accelerate strategic engagement programs in the Caribbean. I commend the subcommittee's work on that. I know you've been doing important work in that area. The time after these hurricanes is, I think, an important time to capitalize on that forward-leaning effort that this subcommittee has supported. I concur with you on the need to build on the international consensus. Any U.S. diplomacy is magnified if we work with our partners in the region. And finally, I would consider targeted sanctions against individuals and businesses that are enabling the Maduro regime. The Maduro regime is enabling external actors that have not paid much cost for supporting Venezuela so far. And individual and sanctions against businesses might produce less of a diplomatic blowback than general sanctions. I conclude my remarks there.
I thank all of our panelists, and great testimony. Dr. Ellis, the deteriorating economic situation in Venezuela makes investment in the country increasingly risky for anybody, especially as Venezuelan oil production continues to decline. In your opinion, why is Russia willing to take these risks?
Thank you, Chairman Duncan. I believe that Russia itself is not the one taking the risk, but rather specific Russian companies, Igor Sechin with Rosneft, presumably with the backing of Vladimir Putin. I believe, frankly, that in addition to the economic interests, both Russia and China have a long-term strategic interest in having a relatively anti-U.S. actor close to U.S. shores that grants them privileged access not only to the arms market and the oil market, but other markets as well. And so, to the extent that it is in both of those countries' interest to sustain that, the small amount of capital relatively that's being invested is a minor price to pay, in my judgment.
One thing I've always thought about is, I mean, Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. They don't need the oil. It's not about that geopolitical dynamic of a natural resource. So with their investment in PDVSA, if Venezuela defaults on the loans, then basically Rosneft will have controlling interest or 49% interest in Citgo. What does that mean?
That's an excellent question, Mr. Chairman. I believe that this illustrates an opportunity in part of the Russian strategy. I think in many ways Russia became somewhat careless as it advanced the last $6 billion in advance loan payment, and I think at the point in which they put in the money for Citgo, what they failed to understand was that the degree to which, for example, with CFIUS review, that their ability to actually take control over Citgo holdings in the U.S. could actually be not denied. So I think Russia finds itself in a difficult position, and indeed public information indicates that they are currently negotiating actually to swap the access to Citgo for potentially other assets, which might include Petropiar, which might include expanded access to Petromonagas and others, which really goes to Russia's farther strategy, in my judgment, which is to use Venezuela's time of need not only to sustain the regime, but to broaden the holdings that they have to Venezuela's 300 billion barrels of oil. And I think their calculations really come down to whether they think at the end of the day, I believe that Russia and China, as much as everyone else, wants a transition away from the Maduro regime, but what they want to transition to is very different. I believe that they are hoping that they can get a transition to an equally anti-U.S. authoritarian regime that will let them legally legitimize their holdings. And so to the extent that they believe that they can get that and not be forced to cooperate with the United States towards a more democratic regime, I think they will still continue to play this game to fund the regime as they have.
So you mentioned a lot of the weapons. Is there any possibility that those weapons could fall in the hands of the criminal element or the narco-terrorist at all?
They already have, Mr. Chairman, especially with respect to small arms. I mean, everything from
beyond small arms. I'm talking about some of the larger, more capable weapons that you mentioned.
When indeed, as my colleague Mr. Toro also mentioned, one of the particular concerns are the Eagle-S anti-aircraft munitions, which, especially to the extent that they are transferred away from the regular army, there's the opportunity for those to begin to be sold to other people. So certainly that, especially as there is a deterioration in order, and would particularly concern me not only is the black market sales, but if there is a collapse of order, a split in the military as part of a succession crisis, that becomes one of the moments in which those type of arms could begin to even more rapidly disappear into other hands.
My time's expired. I'll turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman. You know, as I look at Venezuela, I see the same game plan that was implemented in Cuba. First of all, in Cuba, they started off with the Communist Assembly. In Venezuela, it's called the National Constituent Assembly. Basically, that's to take away power from any kind of democratic effort to put it on the hands of these groups. The second step is basically eliminate the opposition. They eliminated the opposition in Cuba. They're eliminating the opposition, putting them in jail in Venezuela. And the third thing is this whole structure of committees that they're setting up throughout the country, where the committees basically tell on the activity of the public, you know, what the people are doing, and then they can go and put them in jail. So I see the same formula actually being implemented in Venezuela. Now, what can we do about it? I think we pretty much have to depend on all the other countries around Venezuela to continue to put the pressure and do some sort of prohibit them from using the World Bank and so forth But I think other than that, it's, we're kind of limited on what we can do, you know, in that country. So would you agree with that?
And first of all, Mr. Chairman, I would thoroughly agree, and clearly, not only Hugo Chavez, as my colleagues alluded to, but continuing with Nicolas Maduro, have continued not only to follow the Cuban playbook, but indeed have received the benefit of regular consultation, as well as the active presence of the Cuban DGI, the Avispas Negros, and various other organizations, to include those introduced through the doctors. And so, if it looks like Cuba, that's not entirely by coincidence. But beyond that, I actually believe that we are at a unique moment where, although oftentimes sanctions are not effective, sanctions may have a particular opportunity to be effective in this case, specifically because PDVSA is at the brink of a cascading liquidity crisis. You have a series of events whereby which, for example, certain bond payments, the $3 billion that are due in October, that if PDVSA goes into technical default, you have a situation where the creditors, including, of course, Rosneft that you alluded to, and the other PDVSA creditors from the bond from last year, as well as other international claimants such as Crystalex and others, all begin to jump on international assets, which effectively shuts down the regime. I fundamentally believe that there is some point at which, if the money flow that accounts for 96% of Venezuela's ability to import the food and medicine it needs for its people is effectively shut down through that international legal battle, you do force a situation in which you may have regime change. And the way that we structure sanctions may impact how that comes about.
Laurel, what is your...
I think it's important to understand that the U.S. has a lot of leverage. The United States buys 720,000 barrels a day from Venezuela. I've written in the Washington Post last month that there is scope for creativity here if people are willing to explore it. It is nowhere written that the United States has to buy this oil, and that if it does buy it, you could think creatively about conditioning payments to some kind of mechanism where the National Assembly, the duly elected National Assembly in Caracas, approves the use of those payments. You could think of escrow systems. You could think of different ways of leveraging the fact that, yes, the United States needs this oil. Yes, Venezuela needs to sell this oil, but not under any conditions, not under just any old conditions.
Thanking Ranking Member Siris. I concur with you that collaboration from the countries in the region is important. We know from sanctions that they're more effective the more that the key parties are present. I also think there's an opportunity to put pressure on individuals and businesses that facilitate and serve as fronts for the officials in the Venezuelan government that have engaged in corruption or benefit from drug trafficking. Cooperation with regional financial centers, especially places like Panama, would be important. So I do think there is room for creativity, both in the kinds of sanctions and in how the earnings of Venezuela makes.
In terms of what the game plan that I described at the beginning of my comments, do you agree with that? Do you see similarities
to
the Cuban game plan?
I do think that there is a similar level of effort to achieve authoritarian control. I do see a lot of similarities also to what Hugo Chavez did in 1999. It's just when Hugo Chavez shut down the Congress and the Supreme Court in 99, it was popular, and now it's not popular. So I don't let the Venezuelans off the hook, sir.
Mr. Toro, you agree with that game plan that they're implementing?
Absolutely. The difference is that in Cuba in the late 50s and 60s, they had firing squads. And so things went much more quickly. If you're trying to do the same thing, but you're not going to have firing squads, it's going to take you 17 years or 18 years instead of 6 months or a couple of years. But you see the procession. And Venezuela now is at a very peculiar point in its history in that it still has an organized, independent political opposition, hanging on just barely in the Mesa de la Unidad Democrática, mood. They are trying to figure out ways to stay relevant and to stay united and to stay cohesive and to stay effective under a lot of pressure. It is not a given that Venezuela will always have that kind of opposition. Venezuela could end up just like Cuba with only dissidents and not an organized opposition.
My time just ran out, but I do think that Venezuela is going to move on private property in the next year. Thank you, Chairman.
I thank the ranking member. Now we'll go to Mr. DeSantis from Florida.
Well, thanks to the witnesses, and just following up on the Cuba stuff. How do the Cuban military officers and soldiers exert power and influence over the Venezuelan military and government? Doctor?
Venezuela invited in 40,000 Cuban personnel during the Chavez regime. Most of those were doctors, but a significant number were intelligence officers and military advisors. The most important role that they play is really as spies on the activities of the Venezuelan officer corps. It makes it very difficult for anybody in the Venezuelan officer corps to remain independent or non-ideological or non-supportive of the regime. They have also taught the Venezuelans themselves how to conduct surveillance of their own officers. So it's really in support of maintaining regime control that they play a role.
You wanna?
I think it's important to understand also that I think if we go back 5 years, that was very much the case. You had Cuban military spies pretty much in every Venezuelan army unit. In the last 3 years, that has changed a little bit because that was generating a lot of resentment inside the Venezuelan military. It's humiliating to be spied on openly by foreigners. So in the last 3 years, what we've seen is a move away from this unit-by-unit surveillance. And the way I put it in my written statement is that the Cubans used to be everywhere. Now they're just at the top. So you have in Miraflores, in the presidential palace in Caracas, you have a situation room where intelligence gathered mostly by Venezuelans, a little bit by Cubans, is funneled and analyzed and fed to the top leadership really by Cubans. So they've become a kind of McKinsey for dictatorship, if you want to put it that way. They're playing a consultancy role, but a very high-level consultancy role. High-level decisions in Venezuela are never made without asking the Cubans for advice first, and Venezuelan high regime officials are traveling back and forth to Havana all the time.
So the Cuban military officials, intelligence officials, are they shaping the oppression of the Venezuela people and the opposition?
Very clearly.
And what specifically do they do to do that?
Well, it's just day-to-day management of the political crisis. It's taken a lot to break the Venezuelan opposition, to set it against, set various groups against one another. It's taken a lot to identify the fracture points inside the Venezuelan opposition and play on those. If you read Venezuelan news over the last couple of days, we have one part of the opposition now at semi-open warfare with another part. That is not casual. That is the result of a Cuban strategy to sow divisions in a very canny kind of way, because they know that to the degree that the Venezuelan opposition splits, it becomes harder for people like you to put pressure, for the United States to put pressure, because then, you know, if half the Venezuelan opposition is accepting the National Constituent Assembly, how exactly does the Lima Group or the United States or anyone else get off saying, no, this is an illegitimate assembly? So I think that Cubans are very good at this kind of work, understand it very well, and have in Nicolás Maduro a real hardliner. I mean, a man whose entire political vision was built in Cuba.
So if you did not have any of this Cuban influence and Cuban support, what would that mean for the viability of the Maduro regime?
I think to some extent, because Maduro and the inner clique around Maduro, they came up through the Liga Socialista, this Cuban satellite party in Venezuela in the 1970s. It was tiny, but they've thought like Cubans. They've been trained to think like Maduro. Never went to university, but he did go to the School of International Cadres in Havana for a year between 1996 and 1987. That was his university. So he thinks like a Cuban communist. This inner clique around him think like Cuban communists, and in a way, the Cuban advice has been embedded in the way that the Venezuelan security services do their work, and certainly in the way that the leadership clique thinks.
I would just add that basically the Cubans enable President Maduro and his supporters to do what they want to do, sort of faster or better or more effectively. But basically, I agree with Mr. Toro that this is their preferred course of action. It's not being forced upon them.
But it makes their course of action more viable against opposition because of the Cuban support.
Correct. And in fact, right now they're engaged in the strategy of shaping the opposition into an opposition that they can easily manage, right? Pruning off the parts they don't want to deal with.
Great. Well, I thank you, thank the witnesses, and I yield back.
Dr. Ellis, you want to chime in on that?
Yes, sir. I just wanted to say very briefly that in my judgment that the Cubans are only able to imperfectly compensate for the bad management of the Maduro team, but at the tactical level what becomes critical as the crisis deepens is the DGI and others who are monitoring whether or not there's a fracture in the military, because I think with that element of the support, basically a collapse can occur more readily with respect to the military split as a vehicle for ending the regime.
Thank you. Chair, now I'll go to Ms. Kelly from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. While the U.S. has taken action to sanction individuals profiting from the Maduro regime, other nations like China and Russia have enabled Venezuelan actions. Venezuela has accounted for 44% of total lending by Chinese banks in the region. For Russia, Venezuela has been a major market for Russian sales, arms sales, with over $11 billion in sales since 2001. Mr. Trincunas, you stated that most outside actors that trade with Venezuela do so to secure the biggest possible return. As the economic outlook deteriorates in Venezuela, do you expect outside countries to have more interest to exploit a weak state or fear a possible default? And are there any indications that China would inject capital into Venezuela to keep the economy and the government afloat?
That's a very good question, Congresswoman Kelly. And I believe there's a difference between China and Russia on this. I think China has become more reticent in recent years. They're still providing some level of support. They're not willing to completely cut and run because they are concerned about how that would be viewed by other potential and existing partners around the world. They think of themselves as a rising global power, and they know what they do in Venezuela will affect their relations with other countries. So they are reluctant to invest more money, but they don't want to completely leave. On the other hand, Russia, and specifically Rosneft, have been behaving very opportunistically this year in terms of acquiring stakes and joint ventures in Venezuela, as Dr. Ellis and Mr. Toro explained. The one thing to understand about the Constituent National Assembly, in addition to supporting the completion of authoritarianism in Venezuela, it's a vehicle by which the Maduro regime can try to provide some legal cover for what the Russians, for example, are doing in Venezuela.
If I could jump in, ma'am, I also believe that China is now continuing to inject capital. The idea that although China has become more cautious and has not extended new loan vehicles, however, it's interesting, the current $2.7 billion in new projects that was just authorized last week actually is basically money that was paid down out of one of the existing tranches of one of the heavy investment fund. And so China is proceeding cautiously, but I also believe that because the majority of those $62.2 billion that were lent was actually lent on generally 3-year repayment terms and largely on a repaid out of China, out of Venezuelan oil deliveries, that China is not as worried about losing money as many think. As a matter of fact, the amount that could be still owed to Venezuela or to China is maybe as low as $15 billion. And when you consider that China Investment Corporation itself has a $900 billion loan portfolio, for China, taking a loss on $15 billion, which is actually only half of the loans that Russia took as a write-down when it wanted to reestablish its own relationships with Cuba. So my suspicion is that China is continuing to support the regime. It's just doing so in a less overt way than people like Igor Sechin are on the Russian side.
We should note that, as far as we know, Simón Serpa, the PDVSA vice president from finance, who was named as part of the latest round of OFAC sanctions, is in Beijing now and has been for a couple of weeks trying to negotiate some kind of support deal. Beijing is obviously, it's difficult to get information out. It's hard to know if it's going well or not. We'll have much better answers to the question when Mr. Serpa comes back. But it should be noted that individual sanctions against Simón Serpa and against the National Treasurer, Eric Malpica Flores, the First Lady's nephew also, have been very effective in limiting their capacity to look for financing in traditional ways. And so we have Simón Serpa camping out in Beijing for 2 weeks, try to solve that problem.
You yield back. So the chair will go to Mr. Yoho from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I hail from Florida, so we're very, very concerned with this. We've got my past life as a veterinarian. I'll always be a veterinarian. and I had several clients from Venezuela, and we've been following this, and it's only deteriorated in this first half of this century. And it's very disturbing to see what's going on there, from the breakdown of the rule of law, the communist state that's developing, the dictatorship. The liberties that they had are gone. They're already usurping the property and taking the personal property. And I agree with Mr. Sirius that this is the prelude of what Cuba did with the Castro regime. There's so many different avenues that I'm concerned with. You know, the terrorist networks that are developing there from the Middle East, the Chinese influence, the national security, these all tie into national security. But what I see with the Citco deal that was made with the loan, and I want to touch on that just briefly, if Venezuela defaults, Citgo has 3 oil refineries here, 9 pipelines, and 50 petroleum platforms. Are we to believe that if they were to default, Russia takes that over in this area? Is that something that we would anticipate? Or China, if China were to if they were to default with China? Dr. Ellis?
Yeah, well, first of all, my understanding is there's a pending CFIUS review.
Right.
And I think, heavy attention to that would be merited to potentially blocking that. And I think there are strong grounds for blocking the takeover by Rosneft of those assets. And I think my understanding is that out of concern for that potential blockage, Rosneft is actually working right now to switch out those assets for broader assets in Venezuela. But
okay. You know, and we've had personal contacts with people that used to work for the Venezuelan generals that were working with our government through different agencies, I won't mention them, that have firsthand information that the Vice President Assami, when he was the foreign minister, was printing Venezuelan official passports for ISIS and Hezbollah members that were entering our country. And to me, this is just a very severe national security risk. And I look back at the words of John Kerry when he said the Monroe Doctrine was outdated and not needed. I think we need to bolster it and really put an influence and, you know, make sure we secure the Caribbean Basin, South America with our policies. And let's see. The corruption scandals, I mean, they're widespread down there. And you brought up there's over, Mr. Toro, over 1,000 man pads that have gone missing. Is that, did I hear that correctly?
No. Let me restate. There are 5,900 Russian man pads. Is the latest information I have. They're under the control of the Venezuelan army. The question is, what happens? There's a plan now to shift about 1,000 of them to the Bolivarian Militia, where they will not be as well safeguarded. And we know that there are contacts between illicit groups, drug trafficking groups, Colombian groups, groups that have expertise shipping drugs from the northern coast of South America to the United States. You want to hide a man-pads system that you want to send to the United States, just hide it under a sack of cocaine. You can do that.
Yeah.
So this hasn't
That's not
happened.
comforting.
It's not comforting. It's deeply concerning because it's not just that there are these external actors that are very worrying. It's the way that they can overlap and interact. If you have the drug trafficking route because you've set it up for illicit narcotics, what else can you put on that pipe?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I got one more question. Do I have time? I don't have a timer in front of me. What we had heard is that the Maduro regime and even Chavez had the Cuban soldiers around him because he felt they were more loyal to him because they were a student of Castro's. Do we still find that today? Is the Cuban militia that's around him and the military around him, are they more loyal and protective of Maduro than the Venezuelan generals? What are your opinions on that?
I've heard similar things, and to some degree, that may be the case, and it depends on which specific loyalists. One of the difficult issues with many of especially the Venezuelan National Guard generals, is they've become so deeply entwined in narco trafficking and other profiteering from the regime's economic policies that their fate in many ways is actually tied to Maduro's, although they're looking for transition to a more rational management. There's also some speculation, though, whether some, for example, the Avispas Negras, the elite Cuban Guard, are they actually guarding Maduro, or are they actually guarding their own Cuban personnel from the Venezuelans? So that's a little bit of concern.
All right, I yield back. Thank you, sir.
Thank the gentleman. Chair will now go to Mr. Espaillat from New York.
Congressman Espaillat, that's a very good question. The assessment was in 2012, there was about 40,000. However, at that time, Cuba-Venezuelan trade was about 7.5 billion, more or less. Trade has dropped to about 2.2 billion. And a lot of those personnel were being paid for by Venezuela through subsidized oil. So those personnel, some likely have been withdrawn just because Venezuela is not paying anymore. In fact, there was an 8-month oil moratorium last year and early this year. Venezuela started shipping oil at a reduced rate. But if those personnel are not in Venezuela, they've likely been redeployed to the Middle East or Africa or elsewhere in Latin America, because that's one of the ways that Cuba earns money, is through providing those personnel.
And is there any sign that there is a crack in the wall, if you may, in the military? Are there any solid, non-corrupt military professionals that are showing signs
Unfortunately,
of potentially objecting to Maduro Venezuela?
let me just briefly say that the senior leadership is selected for ideological loyalty, and also, as Dr. Ellis and I'm sure Mr. Toro agree, there's the issue of connections to drug trafficking among the Guardia Nacional. The junior officers are heavily ideologized at the National Bolivarian Military University. It's those middle ranks that have not been completely captured by the revolution, and that's where you see this occasional small uprising, the helicopter, the raid on the base. It's that set of officers that I think are sort of most open to their ideas, but they're being watched. You know?
I think about 4 months ago, there was a video, or 6 months ago, there was a video that was little noticed outside the Venezuelan military. It showed a couple of soldiers outside the main army base in Maracay rummaging through sacks of garbage looking for food, okay? The video was not very much noticed outside the military, but inside the military, where everyone has WhatsApp, because they're South Americans, it went viral. Everybody inside the military saw it, and it was a moment when people in different units inside the military realized, wow, it's not just in this unit where we don't quite have enough to eat. For middle-ranking officers, keeping morale and preparedness and just basic discipline in a situation where you can't always feed your troops is very difficult. And for the army, again, trying to secure weapon systems when the troops are hungry is, again, very difficult. So some of the people, I don't know if you can find very many people who are not at all corrupt inside the Venezuelan military, but what you can find is many officers who find that the current government setup is unsustainable and find it difficult to understand why they should try to continue to sustain it.
Is there any way that we could, what's the objection to not buying their oil, for example? That's a significant part of their economy. And the second question is, what can we do about the international, the smaller countries that have benefited from Petrocaribe that seem to be bailing them out in the international community, both by the Organization of American States as well as the United Nations?
Congressman Espaillat, that's a great question. I strongly believe that we're in a moment where sanctions can make a difference, but only if done right and coordinated with an effective strategic communications, not only to Venezuela, but also to Russia and China. First of all, I believe that it's actually important that we do sanctions in a relatively quick fashion. I believe that what you said is absolutely on track, that we need to move forward with sanctions that cut off Venezuela's oil flow, although that will damage U.S. industrial interests. I believe that in some ways that not only doing so shows that we do not have a moral ambiguity in the game, but it also accelerates the rate at which you force a crisis to the regime. And frankly, we also need to signal strongly to China, because China, watches this with one eye in the relationship with the United States. And if they believe that we see this as a strategic play on their part, they may or may not be willing to put in that cash. They've been very cautious about that. I believe also that we do need to, as you pointed out, and of course, Dominican Republic, as you know, that, and I was just actually in Santo Domingo just a couple of weeks ago, right after your visit, sir, the committee's visit, and was struck by the number of Venezuelans that you see. And so you have this ironic situation in which friendly governments continue to go along with the Venezuelan regime, while at the same time they are suffering from the crisis that is created by the Maduro regime. I think we need to manage that diplomacy carefully through a bit of through a bit of tough love, if you will.
We have time for another round. If members would like, I would like to just raise a point that, under Chavez, we saw the Air Caracas flights, Caracas to Tehran, stopping in Beirut. And Beirut is the lead country for Hezbollah. I mean, Party of God, Iranian proxy. How much activity is Hezbollah conducting in Venezuela? Is there still as much Iranian influence as there was under Chavez with Maduro? And are we aware whether the Air Caracas flights are still, the Tehran flights are still going on? Dr. Ellis.
Mr. Chairman, that's a wonderful question, and I believe there's two dimensions to this: the Iranian and the Islamic extremist, and they're overlapping but somewhat separate. Certainly, with the shift,
some of us think they're one and the same, but that's
yes, sir. They're certainly reinforcing, and certainly with the change in style in Iran from President Ahmadinejad to President Rouhani, what you see is at least a low profile. But I believe that Iran's strategy in the region is fundamentally the same. They're continuing to recruit personnel for the Iranian madrasas, from places like Venezuela. They're continuing to introduce Quds forces into the region, although at a somewhat lower level. They are continuing to work, many of us believe, on missile proliferation. And one of the concerns is, and I think you've already seen it, with President Rouhani's re-election in Iran and the freeing up of $150 billion in resources, and indeed the meeting with Maduro just a short time ago, I think you're beginning to see a renewed willingness of Iran to drop a little bit of the caution that it had previously adopted when it was negotiating the end of the sanctions regime. Related to that, clearly I am very concerned not only about Hezbollah but other Islamic radicals, as you rightfully pointed out. Tariq al-Assami, the vice president, is one of the key people, not only in terms of the religious activity, but also the criminal radicalization. Hezbollah, both in Syria and Lebanon, but also in Latin America, is a major drug dealing and money laundering organization with ties in Colombia, Venezuela, elsewhere, that is reinforced and plays with Iran, but also has their own criminal agenda, which really leads to the growth of illicit networks, which fundamentally undermine and threaten the United States. And so I'm glad that you brought that up, sir, because that emphasis has received probably less attention than it should recently, the role that's being played.
That's been an issue with me. Iranians' activity in the Western Hemisphere, not just Venezuela. So we're not going to take our eye off the ball with the things you mentioned and what Iran, Quds Force, their proxy Hezbollah are doing here closer to home. Last question, India, they're buying a lot of oil, I understand. Are they propping up the Maduro government? Is it anything we ought to be looking into? Mr. Trikunis, that's fine. Yeah.
I was just going to make a brief point that I think this is India is an interesting signal of the change that you're seeing, I think, in the Iranian relationship. When Iran re-entered global oil markets after sanctions were lifted under JCPOA, a competitive dimension was introduced into the Iran-Venezuela relationship because they're competing for markets. And in fact, India was traditionally an Iranian market that would later on become a Venezuelan market. So we shouldn't ignore the fact that there is a new dimension to the Iran-Venezuela relationship where Iran is competing for markets after being locked out for so long.
Yeah.
Sir, India is a wonderful point. Thank you for bringing it up. And it's interesting because even though India's orientation toward the region, including under Prime Minister Modi, has been relatively apolitical, it's interesting that until the Yiyang refinery comes on in Guangdong in China, really it's the Reliance refinery in India that has one of the few capabilities in the world to bring on and process Iranian heavy oil coming out of the Orinoco tar belt. It's also of interest that actually Rosneft has a play, the Russian company, to actually buy a stake in that. And some of us believe that part of Igor Sechen's play is to actually refine Venezuelan oil in India. But India, to the extent to which there's probably as much of an impact on Indian potential sanctions and cooperation as there is from U.S. sanctions. And so to the degree to which India is willing to cooperate with us towards the Venezuelan regime, that would bring a big deal of help in bringing pressure on the Venezuelan regime.
Thank you, gentlemen. I said earlier, Iran and Islamic extremism are one and the same. Maybe not one and the same, but not mutually exclusive, I guess is what I meant by that. Any other members have any follow-up questions? Mr. Yoho.
Thank you again. What's your recommendation with Goldman Sachs, who bought $2.8 billion in bonds? Is that something that we should discourage from American financial institutions bailing out a country that suspends or gets rid of their constitution? Thoughts?
I think the latest, the first round of financial sanctions is narrowly constructed to prevent that from happening again. It's unfortunate that it happened once, but as I understand it, sanctions will not allow that to happen again.
Okay.
Congressman Yoho, I think that's a very interesting point, because I think you highlight a mechanism by which you discourage financial institutions in the future of taking the risk of dealing with the Venezuelan government. You don't have to prevent very many of these actions to discourage many of them.
Make an example out of them. I'm a firm believer in that. One last thing, and I don't know if you touched on this, again, with the Citgo operations in the United States and with the Venezuelan government suspending or changing their constitution, which I feel was through an illegitimate election and process, would you sanction those companies, the Citgo companies here, and prevent them from processing Venezuelan crude and replacing with the U.S.? And I know you said it would disrupt our system, but I think we could probably fill that fairly quickly.
I am a Venezuelan national. I have family and employees and friends there, and I think it's important. I cannot support any such move. Okay. And I think it's important to understand clearly the mechanism through which stopping Venezuelan from selling oil to the United States is supposed to create pressure. I mean, this is a hunger strategy. This is, let us starve out the Venezuelan population, let us put a hard stop to food and medicine imports into Venezuela, and then they will overthrow the government. I don't think that is a viable or defensible strategy.
Dr. Ellis?
Frankly, I wrestled with a lot of this in my own testimony, because obviously we don't want to do anything that hurts either U.S. companies or the Venezuelan people, because at the end of the day, our interests are in the well-being of the Venezuelan people. My two concerns is that a go-slow strategy of individual sanctions, while certainly sending messages, prolong the rate at which you have the suffering of the Venezuelan people, while giving Russia and China the opportunity to incrementally bail out and advance their position more and more and more. Whereas the faster that we do sanctions, although immediately painful, it creates a situation in which Russia and China do not have the time nor the scope for being able to bail it out. And, and frankly, it sends a very strong message, not only companies like Goldman Sachs, but companies such as Citgo as well.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Before we end up, hurricanes have affected a lot of our members on this subcommittee and their districts. Our prayers are out to the state of Florida and Texas, and also to the Caribbean, which we have jurisdiction over. Has experienced a lot of damage from the hurricane, so our prayers are with them as well. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7, the members of the subcommittee will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 days to allow statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation and the rules. There being no further business, the subcommittee will stand adjourned.